Hi and welcome to another interview in the Truth According to series. Today I'm joined in the studio by Andrea Matolcsi from Equality Now, and today we're going to be discussing some of the issues surrounding human trafficking. Now, if you want to get involved, perhaps you want to ask Andrea a question or you want to give us your opinion, all you've got to do so is get involved via our social media pages, or you can just leave a comment at the bottom of this video. So Andrea, welcome. Let's start with the question, what is human trafficking?
So human trafficking is the purchase and sale of a human being for their exploitation. Whether or not they consent to that exploitation is irrelevant. There's various types of human trafficking. There's trafficking for sexual exploitation, so that could be into prostitution, into pornography, into lap dancing even. There's trafficking for labor exploitation, that can be being forced to work on a construction site for no pay. There's also organ trafficking, where you traffic a victim and you then sell their organs. There is child trafficking in the sense of adoption, so you put up a child for sale after kidnapping the child. So there's kind of a range of different types of exploitation.
And does the exploitation depend on where you are in the world?
No, this is international law. The United Nations has an international legal instrument called the Palermo Protocol. And that came into force in 2000, and that defines trafficking. So that is what all countries in the world agree to, that this is how we define trafficking.
I mean, naturally, any type of trafficking is not good, but is sex trafficking the worst or the most common?
So there's different kinds of estimates for what trafficking is the most common. Most results come back saying that it is sex trafficking that is what majority of victims are actually subjected to. We know that there is a lot of sex trafficking in every single country, and that can be with victims moved from outside of the country into that country. It can be victims within the country, what we've seen here in the UK with a lot of grooming cases, for example, that is child sex trafficking. And then you also have victims then being taken out of countries into others.
What country with your research shows the worst cases of sex trafficking?
I think it would be hard to put them in into levels. There are definitely countries where it's perhaps more visible because you have much more open sex industries, and within that you have a lot of trafficking, and you can see the trafficking more. You have other countries where you have more closed, let's say, prostitution markets. You have a lot more indoor prostitution, it's a lot more hidden. You still have exploitation in those industries as well, and in those countries as well, it's just not as visible.
So what countries are the most visible?
So a lot of countries, for example, in Southeast Asia and East Asia, within some of the Middle Eastern countries that are more wealthy, so UAE and Dubai, for example, you have a lot more visible exploitation happening in Western Europe, because this is an issue that draws from poor countries to the richer countries. You have a demand in rich countries. They're the ones who can pay for people who are exploited. And in this case, if we're talking about sex trafficking, we're talking about paying for the person in prostitution, usually. So you have a lot of people, clients, willing to spend money on prostitution in those markets. So we see a lot of that being a huge magnet for traffickers to bring victims there from the poorer countries. Within Western Europe, we have a lot of victims from Eastern Europe, from the newly joined EU countries back in 2004, newly joined. We have a lot of victims from Nigeria and other parts of Africa as well.
How do you monitor sex trafficking? How do you know it's taking place, and how can you possibly reach those people that are in need, and can you?
You absolutely can, and I think what it comes down to a lot is political will and kind of police resources and will. So if the police are told that this is a priority, please check those brothels, check those venues of street prostitution, check the online escort services. Do you see any signs of trafficking? If the police are given kind of the signal to do that and the resources to do that in terms of staff and money and surveillance equipment and things like that, then you can very quickly find trafficking no matter where you are. It's just a matter of will and resources, really.
This is probably a stupid question to ask you, but I'm assuming it's illegal. Sex trafficking is illegal, but prostitution in some countries is legal. That's right.
So you have different aspects of prostitution being legal or illegal in various countries, and usually we try to break it down to a few models, but nothing fits, no country fits perfectly into one. But basically you've got the full criminalization model where everyone is criminalized, the person in prostitution, so selling sex, the person buying sex from the person in prostitution, the pimps, brothel keepers, anyone else kind of involved in the organization of it. That is all criminalized. Then you have full decriminalization, where there are almost no laws or regulations relating to prostitution. Everything's been lifted and decriminalized, and prostitution is expected to kind of regulate itself under general health and safety and labor regulations. You have legalization, where all of these activities are legal, but you still have some rules and regulations. So that would be like Germany, for example, or the Netherlands, where things are legalized, but they try to really specify where can you have street prostitution, where can you have brothels, there's licensing, all of these kind of things, trying to basically regulate and contain the prostitution industry that is legal.
But is that in the assumption that the person prostituting themselves are a willing participant?
Yeah, so the legalized and the decriminalized models do assume that you've got plenty of people who are willingly in prostitution and willingly selling sex, and therefore they don't necessarily need the protection of the law unless crimes are committed against them. So that includes rape, robbery, theft, assault, all crimes that we know are very common throughout the prostitution industry, no matter what its legality or illegality is. So that is the basic assumption, which also then means that there are less resources for people who are trying to perhaps exit prostitution, and there are less resources to try to prevent the industry from kind of growing or from people entering. So in Germany and the Netherlands, where you have legalized prostitution, you have less resources for such exiting programs, and you actually have a bit of funding for entry programs trying to help people get into the industry. Kind of training for being in prostitution, basically. So that's the assumption. And then in the fourth model, which is this partial criminalization, which is what is sometimes called the Nordic model because it was started in Sweden, you only criminalize the purchase of sex, pimping and brothel keeping, but you decriminalize the person in prostitution. So the idea is that these countries have recognized that very many people in prostitution actually are not fully willing participants, and they would much rather actually be doing something else. So in their models, they are trying to make sure that there is funding for support services, exiting services, but also harm reduction as well for people who are still in prostitution and choose to stay in prostitution. So in those models, you will have more funding for those kinds of services, while in no way criminalizing the person in prostitution, because the idea is that people in prostitution, very often, they already have been victimized already, so there's no need to actually criminalize them further.
So, I mean, I can understand how, you know, if somebody is in prostitution, then you could almost say that perhaps they're willing, so therefore they're not a victim. But in a lot of cases, also my research tells me that sex trafficking affects young girls.
Yeah.
They're not, you know, they're not women. They're not in you know, perhaps in an adult mind to make that decision. They are, you know, children,
right.
9, 10, 11, 12. How common is that, Andrea?
Yeah, it's quite common. So if you look at studies that try to find out what was the entry age into prostitution, when did someone first start in prostitution, often you see studies that show that a high proportion of the interviewees or the people participating did enter before they were 18. So there is kind of a cutoff line in international law. Anyone under 18 is a child, anyone above is an adult. And so you could have someone entering prostitution at age 17 and they might be seen by a country as a victim still, but as soon as they turn 18, suddenly they're an adult and making a fully informed choice regardless of what happened before they turned 18. So it is quite common. We have plenty of partners who can testify to that, and that includes survivors themselves, women who have exited prostitution. But we work with very many grassroots organizations on the ground providing assistance, and they see that with a lot of the women that they come across and the men that they come across, there is actually a history of prostitution in the background when they were still minors, and that of course influences your life track when you're an adult.
But how does someone get trafficked? Maybe that's a naive question to ask, but how does a 7-year-old or an 8-year-old get taken from their parents and forced into this life? How does that actually happen?
Yes, so there's lots of ways of recruitment, and again, it kind of depends on the country and the circumstances that the victim is coming from. But in terms of parent involvement, unfortunately, sometimes it is actually the parent selling the child, and that can be with the knowledge of where that child will go and what will happen to them. But often it's not. Often it's just they are trying to provide a better future for their child. They think that the child will be taken to a larger city where they can have more opportunities, better education, that someone will take them under their wing.
So someone approaches them and says,
right.
this is
Yeah, exactly. So someone approaches them, it could be a family friend, it could just be someone who has found a village where there are plenty of kind of prospective victims, and they say, look, I can take them to the city, I will put them up with so-and-so, and they'll report to you every once in a while, and then they take the child and they can put them into a brothel, and they can exploit them in other ways as well, of course, and that can be other forms of forced criminality, labor, and things like that. That can be one way of recruitment, and that's not just in countries that we might think that happens. This happens in countries in Eastern Europe as well, where you have such a level of poverty that parents are actually very, very desperate to give their children, a better future, and so they end up selling their child to a trafficker, often without the knowledge. Sometimes it is with the knowledge. So sometimes the parent knows that their child will be prostituted in Amsterdam, for example, or in Zurich in Switzerland, where you have a lot of Eastern European victims as well, and they're so desperate for money and for being able to feed the rest of their children that they might actually just sell off the oldest daughter. So those are some ways, but another very common way is just basically what we would think of as kind of standard pimping in a way. So just someone approaching a prospective victim and engaging in a romantic relationship with them, making them think that this is a long-term relationship, kind of really gaining their trust, gaining their affection. And then at some point they will say, okay, we need money, we have a common future, if we want to build a house together, if we want to move there together, I'm going to need you to do this for me just a few times, or just, then becomes a few weeks, a few months, a few years. And I've spoken to plenty of women, for example, in Amsterdam who were trafficked there from Hungary, and this is kind of the scenario.
So it's romanticized for them?
Well, romanticized, I think they I don't know if they see it as romanticized, but yeah, they have been kind of, their affection has been exploited, let's say, or their want for affection has been exploited, and also their desperate circumstances. Because again, a lot of these victims are coming from places where they have very few job prospects, and very often have not attained a high level of education. So within their countries, they don't have much chances. Very often they're coming from marginalized communities. In Eastern Europe, that can be the Roma community, for example. In other countries, it's other communities that are anyway kind of pushed to the margins. So if someone comes and offers you a job somewhere, even if you know it's going to be in prostitution, you will often take it just because you don't see any other choice in your home community. So with the kind of classic pimping approach, I would say I've spoken to women who say, yeah, I'm just here for a few more months, or just 6 more months until we have enough for the down payment on the house. But then I'll speak to the social worker who will tell me, well, yeah, unfortunately she's been saying that for 4 years now. And the husband or the partner is back in the home country or somewhere else, recruiting more women, taking the money, and so on. So there's various ways, but I think sometimes what people think of about when we think about trafficking is this kind of overt violence, overt coercion, someone being thrown into a van, things like we see in Hollywood movies, and that absolutely does happen. But I think the majority of cases are much more subtle forms of coercion, like what I'm talking about, through relationships or just through economic need, where you just don't feel you have another choice. And for us, if you don't feel you have another choice, that's not really making a truly willing decision to go into an industry, for example. It's actually a lack of choice that has put you in that situation.
And then I guess that must be harder to police as such. How do you then find these people? Because I guess in some ways they're almost like like you and I.
Absolutely, yeah. So it's quite difficult for police. There are a lot of efforts in a lot of countries to really step up how they help victims and how they identify victims. But I think a lot of trouble that police are facing, and the criminal justice system in general, is when they're faced with a victim, if the victim doesn't necessarily see themselves as such sometimes, for example, like some of the women I'm talking about, or they do, but then they're very scared of kind of what is the alternative, because they have family back home, they might have children that they're supporting. The traffickers know the children, they make threats accordingly, so they say, if you say anything, I'm going to take your child, or I'm going to hurt your parents, or whatever. They know exactly where the victims come from, they know their communities. So the threats are very real, and they are enforced. Often women are threatened through examples of other women. I can think of cases in Zurich in Switzerland where you had, until about a year ago, a legal street prostitution zone. And it turned out that 98, 99% of those women were brought over from Hungary, from a very poor region in northeast Hungary. And some of the ways that those traffickers kept those women, let's say, in check, would be to torture them in front of each other. And that could be in various ways. That could be with cigarettes, that could be inserting objects into them and things like that. And not to mention rape in front of the other women. So when the police come and approach those women, it's such a level of intimidation that it's quite unlikely that they'll actually ask for help. They are for a very justified reason, they're actually very scared to ask for help.
And I read somewhere that it was 98% of sex trafficking is with women. Has that changed at all? Is it men and boys as well now, or is it predominantly still women?
Well, it's the overwhelming majority is still women. You do have certainly boys, and to a lesser extent men trafficked into prostitution and other forms of sexual exploitation, absolutely. I would say more so with children. But because the sex industry is such, it is relatively, it's based on basically female exploitation. So it's you're going to have majority women in that industry, and that's why if you traffic into that industry, you're going to have majority female victims, because that's what the demand is there for. So you still have, in any country that you look at, you will have mainly women and girls as victims of sexual exploitation. Yeah.
Well, I mean, how is it monitored in terms of trying to improve the situation, or is it getting worse? I mean, where are we now?
I think if monitoring is improved, that might show more victims. So seeing more victims doesn't necessarily mean that it's expanding or getting worse. It might actually be a good sign that police are getting better at detecting victims, that we're getting better at helping victims. I think there are many ways to monitor. What police in Sweden do, where they have the partial criminalization that I was talking about. They will go online, for example, and they will look at escort sites, and they will have a look according to certain indicators whether someone might be trafficked, and if so, then they'll look into it. So what you can do there is look if many women have the same phone number, for example, then you think, okay, maybe this is organized, so maybe this is organized crime or one particular pimp behind several women. You can look at, does she just simply look very young? Does she look under 18? Another sign that they have, that police in Sweden have, is if you can actually see the woman's face. Because if a woman is on her own in escorting without any kind of outside interference, then often she will blur out her face, or she won't want her face to be public online. So if there's a victim's face showing, then they can have an idea, okay, probably she doesn't even know that her photo is up there, and this might actually be trafficking.
With regards to child trafficking, what countries are where, the most affected when it comes to that? Because in order for these industries to to continue and flourish, I guess there's a supply and demand, isn't there?
Yep.
So people are asking for these, and they are children, and I don't know what the word is. I'm just intrigued as to how this is still happening in
Right. So it really is every single country, because in every country you will have a demand for paid sex, and you will have a demand for victims, so that you can exploit, whether paid or not. And in terms of children, this is in every country, and as we've seen recently in the UK as well, there's been lots of high-profile cases over the past 2 or 3 years in Oxford, Rochdale, Rotherham recently, where you had underage girls being passed around, for example, and being traded for sex. So there is a demand for children everywhere, unfortunately. Again, I think in some countries, because it's a bit more, the police are a bit more hands-off about it, let's say, or the government is more hands-off, it's more known as kind of a paradise for child sex tourists, for example. If we're talking about Cambodia or the Philippines, where it's much more easy to purchase a child. It's much more well-known, but that certainly doesn't mean that it's not happening pretty much everywhere else as well. Yeah.
But if the government and the officials and the police know that this is happening, why isn't the situation getting better, do you think? Is it commercial reasons? Is it money? Business?
I think there's various reasons. I think lots of governments are truly putting in a lot of effort and resources. Some are not. I think some who are not, either they just don't think it's a priority, they don't think that it's a widespread problem. Some might be so overwhelmed by it. They know that it's massive. It's a massive industry with, indeed, as you said, a lot of money. And so there are a lot of vested interests in this industry. And And so you do have a lot of pushback when people try to reduce the industry, because there's a lot of money to be made by illegal and legal industries, companies and establishments and things like that. So I think it's a combination of those factors, but ultimately you do need the political will from the top saying, okay, this is an issue for us, we know that it's going on, and that's why we're going to bring in strict laws, we're going to make sure that they're implemented, we're going to train police, we're going to raise awareness among the general public. Because if the general public doesn't know what's happening right in their community or in their neighborhood, then you've got a resource there for help that's really untapped, because often it can be the neighbor reporting something suspicious next door, or seeing if there's street prostitution in their area. They might say, okay, I think there's some children there, for example, or some women there who clearly have pimps, and then they can report that to police. But if they're not aware that there's a situation of exploitation, they're not in the position to do that.
I know we've touched on poverty, just now, but do you find that in the really poor countries that the situation is worse? And I know you've said it happens in every country, and it's very hard to sort of assess what country is worse than others. But in these countries where they're absolutely destitute, is it very hard to turn your back on an industry that is clearly very profitable?
Yes, I think if you look at what people in that industry are experiencing, I think it's quite easy to turn your back. So I think if a parent, for example, if they actually realized what their child is experiencing on a daily basis after they've asked them to do that in order to support the family, then I think you would have a lot less of it. I think, again, sometimes parents give their children to someone else who then takes them to a larger city or another neighborhood or another village, and they might not actually, it's not so visible to them what the child is experiencing. They get back a child who then is barely speaking, is wetting their bed as an adult, things like that, and that's when they maybe realize, okay, maybe it wasn't so easy for them. But I think what any country has to do is not accept basically sexual exploitation just because there are very few options. The idea is to create options, and that means creating jobs, making sure that people are getting a certain level of education and training, and making sure that when they have that, they have employment that they can go to where they can support themselves and their family if need be, and so that no one has to be subjected to exploitation.
But these people that are smuggling these women, these children, people are aware that they're doing it, aren't they? I mean, you can't. Well, you'd like to think that you can't smuggle children, and people don't realise. But how are they physically being able to do this?
So you can get around the system. You can have obviously fake passports. If you're talking about external, if you have internal trafficking, it might actually be much less difficult for the traffickers, because it can happen in just one single community. And again, I'm talking about the grooming cases in the UK, for example, and in other countries where you have much more local trafficking going on. These are very often children, and this is why they very often become victims, because they're in a situation where it's not as noticed if they're missing. They might be coming from the care system, or they might be coming from a household where the parents are not so much paying attention to what their kids are doing, where they are. And even if they are, it's hard to control a 15, 16-year-old and their movements. So it's actually not that difficult, because why would police look into it if it's not on the radar? But what we saw in a lot of cases here in the UK and elsewhere is that even if it is on the radar, there is often an assumption that this is, let's say, a lifestyle choice that victim chose to make. So you've got a 14 or 15-year-old who's being exploited for sex within groups, or who might be being sold online. And there's an assumption that, well, she made this lifestyle choice, she just wants new clothes or a new mobile phone, and she just wants money. And you're basically kind of denying the victimhood of that individual, because at 14 and 15, I think most people would agree that you're not actually in a situation to be able to consent to that. And by international law, you actually can't. You're a child. So any prostitution of a child is trafficking, basically by law. So I don't think it's very, very difficult for any kind of traffickers. Then you do have the situation or the factor of, especially in some countries, of assistance from, let's say, border agency, from police. You do have people being paid off. So in that sense, it can also be easy to get someone across a border or within a town, to get police to turn a blind eye. You have plenty of situations where police themselves are abusing the people in prostitution and are extorting, let's say, services from them. They'll say, okay, we won't arrest you if you provide us with services, basically. And they can do that also for letting children pass through and things like that. So unfortunately, there is corruption, and that also enables the trafficking of children and adults to be easier.
I know you mentioned that education is an important factor in kind of moving things along, but I guess the issue is in countries that are very poor, when they don't have basic provisions like food and water, how is money going to then be spent on educating people, families and children that, you know, that sex trafficking isn't really the way out, the option?
Yeah, no, I think it does have to go beyond education, of course, and you have to actually provide alternatives. And that's the model that we're talking about that's in place in Sweden, and it's also in place in Norway and Iceland, and several countries are considering it at the moment. It's got the three important pillars. So one is the decriminalization of people in prostitution, the other is the criminalization of the demand, the purchase of sex. But the third, equally important, is the provision of services and alternatives. So part of prevention is to make sure that people do have alternatives, because of course you can't say, well, we'd like to reduce this market so that there's less victims of exploitation, but we're not going to give you any other options. In extremely poor countries, this is something that requires such a holistic approach. And it's one of those issues that requires a holistic approach, and there's several of these, of course. So it's not enough to just target certain aspects of the industry or certain aspects of sex trafficking. You do need programs to target poverty as such. You need programs to target education, and programs to target general equality and inequality between women and men, between ethnicities, between disabled and non-disabled. All of these inequalities that exploitation can thrive on, basically.
And have you found that there are any trends in terms of someone's religious or racial profile in terms of the amount of people that are trafficked, or is it really random?
I think it's quite random. I think it depends on if it's organized crime, traffickers will they'll find a community and they will take victims from there. So they will find a community where there are a lot of desperate people, a lot of people who don't have the connections or necessarily the know-how to be able to check out a job offer abroad. They're desperate to take any offer that they can get. And then they do that. So again, if we're looking at some countries and some cities in Western Europe, you will have a lot of victims coming from a particular place, because that's just how the network developed for the traffickers. So, yeah.
If you've just joined us, we're joined in the studio today by Andrea Matolcsi from Equality Now, and we're talking about sex trafficking. We're really interested in your opinion, so if you want to get involved or perhaps ask Andrea a question, all you've got to do is get involved via our social media pages, or simply just leave a comment at the bottom of this video, and I'll be sure to ask Andrea the question for you. So Andrea, let's just talk about some global events that take place: the Brazilian World Cup, the Rugby World Cup, the Rugby Cup next year. Do you find that there's a spike in terms of sex trafficking at these events, and how do you possibly manage something like that?
I think research points both ways on that. So some research does say that there is a spike, that there is suddenly an increase and an influx of women and men around those big sporting events. Other pieces of research say that not really, it's kind of the same level, or that it hasn't spiked significantly enough to say that this is a result of the sporting event. I think for us it does make sense, just because you do have increased demand. So I think what people saw around the London Olympics, for example, is new brothels being set up that weren't there before. So that is a sign that, okay, part of the industry then is being kind of set up around the sporting event. But research really goes both ways on this.
Okay, let's move on to what we can possibly do. So I would like to talk to you about Equality Now in a bit, in terms of what your organisation does to help these victims. But talk to me a bit about the Nordic model, which I know that we've touched on briefly, which was a model that Sweden adopts, and now Iceland and Norway,
well, yeah.
And other countries are considering it. So tell me about that.
Sure. So this is the three-pillar model that I was mentioning before, and it basically comes from the point of view that prostitution as such, so not just sex trafficking, but prostitution is founded on the inequalities that I was mentioning before. And first and foremost is inequality between women and men, but it's inequality between rich and poor, between different ethnicities, between able and not disabled, and disabled and not disabled. and different communities. And so all these socioeconomic inequalities are basically allowing prostitution to thrive, but at the same time, prostitution is sustaining them. So for us, for example, as an international organization working for equality between women and men, you absolutely cannot get full equality when you have an industry that's based on inequality between women and men. Mm-hmm. So Sweden was the first to pioneer this approach in 1999, and then about 10 years later, Norway and Iceland both enacted the same legislation. And now you've got a handful of countries that are considering it. So there's bills before parliaments in Canada, in Northern Ireland. We hope for a bill soon in the Republic of Ireland. England and Wales has had a similar bill before, and it will probably be considered again. Scotland as well, France. Even countries that have fully legalized prostitution are talking about addressing the demand side more. So that's what this model tries to do, is that because it's founded on these inequalities, you need to decriminalize the people in prostitution, you need to criminalize the demand, because without the demand there would be no supply. It's as simple as that. But you also need to criminalize pimping and brothel keeping at the same time. So everyone who's exploiting or benefiting from the exploitation of the person in prostitution. And then the third pillar being the support services for exiting, but in general for people in prostitution. Anyone who is in prostitution and wants any kind of assistance should have that provided for them.
Do you think that's one of the main issues then surrounding victims trying to get help, is that they're worried that they're going to get the book thrown at them, so to speak?
Yeah, absolutely. So where you have prostitution in the sense of the sale of sex criminalized, you've got those women and men in a very difficult situation, because if a crime is committed against them, if they're raped, which again is quite common, if they're raped, if they're robbed, if anything is taken from them, then they have very little recourse, because if they go to the police can very easily say, but you're engaged in an illegal activity. And so that's the idea, is that if you have that side of the transaction, let's say, fully decriminalized, that you will have more people coming forward when crimes are committed against them. And this is what colleagues are seeing in Sweden, for example. Both police and NGOs working on the ground with people currently in prostitution, they see that after this model was enacted around over 10 years ago now, they have more people coming to them for assistance, because they feel that suddenly the criminal burden has been shifted from them and onto the buyers who are creating the demand for them, who are the reason that they're actually in the industry in the first place. So they have seen an increase in people feeling that they are less stigmatized, and that they can come to police for assistance or to report exploitation that they see within the industry. They might say, okay, I'm actually totally fine, I'm happy staying in the industry, but I noticed that in that brothel or in that flat, something is not quite right. Could you look into it? So yeah.
But if it's working in Sweden, and clearly the stats and the figures show that it is, why aren't other countries adopting it straight away? Why are we waiting 10 years before another country decides to adopt that principle? Yeah,
well, there has been an increased push towards this, and especially in Europe and in parts of North America. So again, especially Canada at the moment. You do have increased recognition that if you want to decrease sex trafficking as such, you're going to have to decrease the prostitution market, and you're going to have to target the demand side. So the European Union and the Council of Europe, the two main regional bodies here in Europe, have both come out in favor of this model recently, earlier this year rather. You do have an increased amount of governments talking about it, bringing forward bills. So there is a shift towards this, but there are still countries that are more hesitant. They are thinking about it. Everyone has to think about it, because it's such a debated topic at the moment and such a debated model. I think there are various reasons for that. For some of these countries, like Germany and the Netherlands, they legalized their industries about 10 years ago as well, at the same time that Sweden went the other way. And I think for them, they still want to kind of make it work. They want to see if they can make legalization work, although what we're seeing that it's just a failed experiment, basically, because even in their legal industries, you've got lots of trafficking, you have minors, you have women who did not know that they would be in prostitution or whose money is being taken from them. And police are actually quite frustrated in these countries, because they would like to help. They see that there are victims in the industries, but because everything is legal, and a lot of these activities that are exploitative are legal, including the brothel keeping and the pimping, they have very little tools that they can actually use to help victims and to hold perpetrators, to bring them to account. So in these countries, there is nonetheless still kind of this they would like to treat prostitution as kind of a job like any other and an industry like any other, and that's why they think, all right, if we have everything legalized, we have better chance of monitoring, of it being like, let's say, clean, of making sure that people who are in the industry are actually really voluntary and they're keeping their own money. Unfortunately, like I said, this is not what we're seeing, but there is kind of a hesitancy to recognize this. And whether that's because these countries are getting a lot of tax dollars from it in some cases, might be a factor. But in other cases, they're also seeing they're actually not getting that much from it because a lot of it still happens so much underground. And next to their legal industries, they have huge flourishing illegal industries. So I think the more that they recognize the levels of exploitation in their industries, I think the more the discussion will actually shift towards this, because what the UK has and what some countries have, well, what England and Wales and Northern Ireland have at the moment, is not quite the Nordic model, because you do have criminalization of the sale of sex in England and Wales and Northern Ireland, for example. But they criminalize the purchase of sex from a victim of trafficking. So if you've got a pimp or you've been trafficked, if someone purchases sex from you, then that is illegal, that's a crime. This is something that is suggested by European legislation, but so far few countries have tried it. That includes Finland and these parts of the UK. And this is something that some legalized countries are thinking about. So they're not quite yet comfortable going with the full Nordic model. But they're thinking about this kind of halfway approach. Meanwhile, they have huge growing movements within those countries. You've got a lot more activists, you've got a lot more survivor activists in legalized countries coming out and saying this is not working. We've still got a lot of exploitation. If they're a service provider, they say our hands are tied, we can't help people as much as we would like to because of this fully legalized system, so please change it and please go the way of the Nordic model.
With regards to your opinion or what Equality Now stands for, do you think that enough is being done to help the sex trafficking industry?
No, no, and that's why we're pushing governments and we're pushing at regional and international bodies to do more, because like I said, there is in a lot of places there's good legislation in place, but in a lot of places it's lacking, it's not good enough legislation, and that's why we're saying if you really want to combat sex trafficking and if you really want to combat exploitation in the sex industry, you need to go the Nordic model way. That's at the level of laws. Even where you have some good laws, you still need to make sure that they're being implemented. So in some countries, we are more pushing for making sure that, again, police have resources, that they have the training needed so that those good laws can be implemented.
Okay, we're going to go to a couple of questions now, if that's okay.
Yep.
Cara wants to know if the internet has fueled an increase in trafficking.
I think it's made it a lot easier. Absolutely. You have, if you go online, I think you can very easily find, obviously, escort services, brothels, anything like that. And the proportion of that is trafficking, we can say is significant. So if we look at websites like Backpage.com and Craigslist in the US, but some are operating globally, they're constantly being reported for having victims on those web pages, being advertised for sex. So it's certainly a problem, and it's something that has made it very easy because you have even more kind of anonymity in some of those websites. You don't even need a name to register. You don't need your personal details. You can pay using you can pay without being identified, and so I think it has made it somewhat easier. It also has made it easier for recruiters. So for example, organizations in the police in the Netherlands are seeing a lot, and it's certainly not just the Netherlands, is young girls being recruited through chat rooms, through Facebook.
So it's kind of changed, it's adapted.
It's absolutely adapted because it took advantage of a really useful resource for traffickers, absolutely, because you can reach multiple victims at once. It's not very resource intensive. You send a few messages, you will get ignored by many, but you will get some replies back. You start sending your standard messages back and forth. And you have cases where it can be one pimp or one trafficker controlling maybe 10, 15 or more young women and girls through one website. So I think it has made it easier, yeah.
Okay, and John wants to know whether it's more boys or girls that get trafficked these days, and whether you've seen any significant change in the last 10 years.
So among child trafficking, I would say that if you're looking at sexual exploitation, you absolutely have both boys and girls getting trafficked. The majority is still girls, but you have lots of boys getting trafficked as well. And in terms of other types of trafficking, it depends. If you're looking at domestic servitude, for example, you will probably get more young girls. If you're looking at things like forced criminality, like begging, and labor, like construction, things like that, you will likely have more boys.
Okay, and Tom wants to know, what can individuals do to help this issue? Because you've already touched on the fact that in some countries it's such an issue, it's such a widespread issue, and it's almost overwhelming. What can the individual person do?
I think individuals can absolutely learn more about the issue. They can go to organizations' websites, they can go to Equality Now's website, learn more about how the issue is affecting their communities and their lives, and then they can find ways that they can intervene. So I think one major way is simply raising awareness among the people that they know. This is hugely powerful because many people actually don't know that this is going on. If there's not enough awareness raising, they're not aware that this is happening. So it can be extremely powerful for one person within their own networks, just to let people know, look, I found this resource on human trafficking. It explains this issue. Did you know this was happening? I think that can be absolutely helpful. In general, if we're talking about addressing the demand side, let's say, what some men and boys can do is they can kind of contribute to a culture where that's less acceptable, where they say, well, no, we see women as equal to us, so we don't want to use them in that way, and kind of to discourage that demand through that way as well, because you can learn a lot from your peers.
Okay, and Laura wants to know, what happens to victims that are, that they've been saved by the authorities or they've been contacted by the authorities? What happens to those victims?
It, again, depends on the country and the services that you have available and in place and funded. Ideally, that person will get long-term support, because what many of these victims have experienced is so severely traumatic. It's something that will take years to get over, and you never fully get over. So it's something that stays with victims pretty much forever. So what they need is long-term assistance, including psychosocial assistance, and that can be counseling, that can be trauma therapy. But they also need assistance in terms of training and job opportunities, because again, often victims, not always, but often do come from education, lower levels of education or a poor background. And so if you, let's say, rescue a victim from a brothel, for example, and you send them back home to the exact same situation that they came from, but with no alternatives, it's very likely that they will be re-trafficked. So in many countries you have a call, and that includes in the UK, you have an increased calls for longer term support, not just a few months or not just 45 days as it is in some countries, but to recognize that victims do need longer term support in all these areas.
John wants to know whether we're just scratching the surface on what is obviously a massive issue.
In terms of knowledge about the scale of it, sure. It's what we do see is the tip of the iceberg, because it's such a hidden crime in many places, and where it's not, you sometimes have lack of reporting. So you might know that it's there, but if the police aren't recording it, then your official statistics say that it's not really a big issue. But what does reach support services and what does reach the police is certainly the tip of the iceberg, because those are the victims that have been recognized, and the majority are not, unfortunately.
Where do you think trafficking is most prolific? I know you've said that it's widespread, but where is it most prolific? Can you identify those areas?
If we're looking at sex trafficking, I think it really is everywhere. Most prolific, again, I think it's if you have more kind of visible sex industries, then you will see it more. But if you have countries where you have things a bit more closed, it's still absolutely going on, but it's more indoors, let's say, rather than on the street. So I think what this is really dependent on is, bringing people who have less choice and less options, and trafficking them to places where there is a demand for those people, because people have the money. And that's why this is an inequality issue, because you've got kind of the better off countries and better off individuals who have the money to pay for victims. So you have a lot of trafficking from the poor countries to the rich countries, and a lot of exploitation in the rich countries. But you've got also a lot of local exploitation, internal trafficking in the poor countries as well.
Joe wants to know how the media plays a part in all of this.
The media has a huge part to play when we talk about awareness raising. Of course, a lot of this comes down to the media, making sure that this issue is in the mainstream, that it's talked about on the news, it's talked about in interesting shows that people will watch, and just making sure that it's getting out there that this is an issue and that it's something that's happening in every single community. So the media does have a role in getting the word out, and it also has a role in kind of getting the word out in a responsible way, which we've seen a lot of media outlets do over the last few years that have taken up an interest in the issue and have done some excellent reporting on it from a very realistic angle and not kind of sensationalizing or talking about sex slavery or these kind of tantalizing terms, but saying this is exploitation that's going on, this is suffering that's going on, and this is what we can do to prevent it. So not just kind of showcasing a victim's experience, but then moving forward from there and saying, okay, but how can we prevent more individuals falling into that situation?
I'd like to ask you a question. It's such a widespread issue and so big, and just mind-blowing really when I was doing the research as to how vast this is and how widely it affects everybody. Are we ever going to be able to battle it realistically? Because sex sells.
Yeah, sex sells, but I think in countries where you have taken this approach, this Nordic model approach that I'm talking about, you have seen a reduction in the market. So it's a question whether or not you can fully eradicate the sex market or prostitution as such. But I think it's many have recognized that it's a very achievable and it's a very worthwhile goal to try to reduce it, because the only way that you will reduce the exploitation within the industry is to try to reduce the industry, and that's through that model that we're calling for, this Nordic model approach. They have seen decreased numbers of trafficking, and they have seen decreased indoor and outdoor industries. So it is certainly possible, and it just requires lots of political will, and it requires an attitudinal shift, because as long as people think it's okay for basically one half of society to exploit the other, it's going to keep going. But if you start raising awareness and people start realizing this is actually not okay, this is not the kind of society I want to live in, then people will start taking more action against it.
And we've spoken briefly about the media's impact, but what about celebrities? Do they play a fundamental role in raising the awareness?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's positive when celebrities take on an issue such as this, and we have had some celebrities take on the human trafficking issue and other violence against women and girls issues. And I think that does help just because it brings visibility to an issue that might otherwise not get so much airtime. Yeah.
Andrea, thank you very much. And just lastly, if people want to find out a little bit more what they can do and just more information and more awareness, what should they do?
Sure, so they can go to our website. It's www.equalitynow.org, and there we have resources on how to get involved in our campaigns and our work to reduce sex trafficking and sexual exploitation. And we're also happy to help them on to contacts in their local countries if they would like to get involved locally.
Andrea, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I appreciate it.
Thanks.
Thank you very much for watching. There's going to be more of these videos uploaded through the week, so make sure you continue to check back. See you later.